In today's lesson, we are going to be factoring quadratic trinomials in which the leading coefficient is not 1. You will want to remember, as you work through the lesson, that factoring simply reverses or will undo the distributive property, which is the property that we use when we multiply two linear binomials together to give us the quadratic trinomial. Let's begin today's lesson by reviewing how to factor a quadratic trinomial whose leading coefficient is 1. To do this, we're going to look at the factors of a negative 18 that will add to a positive 3. We're going to make an organized list to keep track of our work so we can quickly find the factorization. In the right column, we're going to write down the factors, p and q, of the negative 18. In the left column, we're going to write down the sum of those two factors, and we want the sum of those two factors to be a positive 3. Let's begin. Let's set p equal to a negative 6 and the q equal to a positive 3. Now negative 6 times 3 is a negative 18. However, when we add those two factors together, we get a sum of negative 3. So that tells us this is not the factor set that we need to use. But we are close. So let's just change the sign of the negative 6 to a positive 6 and change the sign of the 3 to a negative 3. Now when we add those two factors together, we get our sum of positive 3. So that tells us that this is the factor set that we need to use to factor this expression. Now we know from past experience that when you factor a quadratic trinomial, you're going to end up with two linear binomials. So let's go ahead and open up two sets of parentheses. Now we know the first term in each factor will be the x. The second term in each factor will be the factors that we just found in our list. We've found p to equal a positive 6, so we're going to write a positive 6 in the p's position, and we found the q to equal a negative 3, so we will write negative 3 in the q's position. And now we're done factoring. We have factored x squared plus 3x minus 18 into two linear binomials, x plus 6 and x minus 3. Let's multiply 2x minus 1 times x plus 11 using the horizontal method to organize our work. We're going to distribute the first term, 2x, times the second factor, which is x plus 11. The second term that we are going to distribute is minus 1. We're going to multiply it to the second factor, which is x plus 11. Let's begin distributing. 2x times x yields 2x squared. 2x times positive 11 yields a positive 22x. Moving to the next term, negative 1 times x yields negative 1x. And negative 1 times a positive 11 yields a negative 11. Now since we are adding the two binomials together, we don't need the sets of parentheses. So let's rewrite the expression without the parentheses. So 2x squared plus 22x minus 1x minus 11. Now we're going to combine the like terms and write the result. And the result will be 2x squared plus 21x minus 11. Now notice that we have a quadratic trinomial whose leading coefficient is not 1. So let's factor this trinomial and reverse the distributive property that we just used to get it. Let's begin by finding AC. Now the product of AC in this case is going to be negative 22. And we get that by multiplying 2 times the negative 11. Now the next thing we do is to factor that product, negative 22, so that we find the two factors that will add up to positive 21x. And in this case, those two factors will be 22 and a negative 1. Our next step will be to rewrite that middle term, the 21x, using the two factors that we just found. So that looks like this: 2x squared plus 22x minus 1x minus 11. Now notice that this line looks exactly like the line from the multiplication process, and that makes sense because we are reversing the distributive property. So the next move will be to group the two factors together. So let's group the first two factors together, and that yields 2x squared plus 22x plus the sum of negative 1x and negative 11. And that brings us to the second line of the multiplication process. So the next step will be to factor the GCF from each group. Now the greatest common factor from the first group will be 2x. So we'll factor the expression out, and that yields x plus 11. Examining the second group, we see that the GCF is a minus 1. So if we factor that expression, we get x plus 11. Now notice we are now at the second line of the multiplication process, so we are almost finished. We just have to organize our work into the two factors. So the first factor contains the two terms 2x and negative 1. And the second term will be x plus 11. So we have factored a quadratic trinomial whose leading coefficient is not 1. And we did it by reversing the distributive property. Let's look at another example. We are going to multiply 2x plus 3 times 3x plus 5, and let's once again use the horizontal method to organize our work. So we're going to distribute the first term, which is a 2x, times the second factor, which is 3x plus 5. The second term of the first factor is a positive 3. So we're going to distribute that to the second factor, which is 3x plus 5. Let's distribute the 2x. 2x times 3x yields a positive 6x squared. The 2x times the 5 yields a positive 10x. Moving to the second term, 3 times 3x yields a positive 9x. And 3 times 5 yields a positive 15. Now since we're adding the two expressions together, we don't need the parentheses, so let's rewrite the expression without them. 6x squared plus 10x plus 9x plus 15. Now we're going to combine like terms and write the quadratic trinomial in standard form. 6x squared plus 19x plus 15. Now we have written the quadratic trinomial in standard form, and we notice that its leading coefficient is not 1. So let's immediately factor this expression by undoing the distributive property. Once again, we're going to find the product of a times c, the leading coefficient times the constant. So AC is going to be the product of 6 times 15. Well, 6 times 15 yields a positive 90. Now we need to find the factors of 90 that will add up to the positive 19, the b term. And those factors are 10 times 9. 10 times 9 is 90, and 10 plus 9 is 19. Now let's rewrite that middle term using those two factors that we just found. So the expression now has four terms. 6x squared plus 10x plus 9x plus 15. Now notice we have arrived back at the next to last line of the distributive property. And remember, factoring will undo the distributive property. So we can take a look at our work to figure out the next step. And the next step will be to group the two terms together. So let's group the first two terms together, and that yields 6x squared plus 10x. We'll group the second two terms together, and that yields 9x plus 15. Now notice we're progressing backwards through the distribution process. So the next step will be to factor the GCF from each group. If we examine the first two terms, we see that the GCF will be 2x. Let's factor the GCF from the expression, and that yields 3x plus 5. If we examine the second group, we see that the GCF is a positive 3. Factoring the GCF from that group yields the factor 3x plus 5. Which brings us in the distributive property to the first line of the multiplication process. So now it's a matter of collecting the terms into the factors that gave us the quadratic trinomial. So the first factor is 2x plus 3. And the second factor is 3x plus 5. So we started off with a quadratic trinomial whose leading coefficient was not 1. We reversed the distributive property and arrived back at the two linear binomials that gave us the quadratic trinomial. Let's factor a quadratic trinomial whose leading coefficient is not 1. To do this, let's find the product of a and c. Now the leading coefficient is 8 and the constant is negative 3. So the product of AC will be 8 times negative 3. So A times C yields a negative 24. Our next step will be to factor that negative 24 so that we find the two factors that will add up to the middle term, which in this case is a negative 2x. So the factors of a negative 24 that add to a negative 2 are negative 6 times 4. So let's rewrite that expression so that the middle term will be the sum of those two factors. 8x squared plus 4x minus 6x minus 3. Step 4 is to group the terms into two groups. Let's group the first two terms together, and that yields 8x squared plus 4x plus the sum of the next two terms, a negative 6x and a negative 3. Step 5 will be to factor the GCF from each group. The GCF of the first group is 4x. Factoring that expression out yields 2x plus 1. Examining the second group, we see that the GCF is a negative 3. Factoring that from the expression yields 2x plus 1. Now we know that two linear binomials will give us a quadratic trinomial. So we set up our first factor, which will contain the terms 4x and negative 3. And the second factor, which we know to be 2x plus 1.